In terms of what we heard today, I'd love to know first what you think of the timing and the fact that it was Joe Biden who made this announcement and not Israel.
Right. I mean, well, the timing comes on the heel of incredible international pressure, Joe, on Israel to halt this offensive in Rafah. The pressure's coming from the International Criminal Court, where, of course, Israel is not a member, but still, you know, there is some weight there coming from that high court. On top of that, our administration, the U.S. administration, the Biden administration, has been putting pressure on Israel also publicly to halt the effort in Rafah and declaring a red line that we wouldn't provide any assistance to Ukraine that would be in Rafah proper. So I think the president felt like he had to do something. He may have been worried that the Israelis were not going to actually take the ceasefire or propose the ceasefire to Hamas. And so he was trying to get out ahead of them. Or maybe this is actually helpful to Netanyahu to have the U.S. government come out first and propose it publicly.
Well, it becomes a question of incentives, Evelyn. After just a few days ago, earlier this week, we were hearing Israeli officials say it was going to take them another 7 months to finish the job with Hamas. What incentive does Israel have to make this offer? And what incentive does Hamas have to accept it?
Well, there is a great incentive, as I mentioned, on the side of Israel because they're really losing the public relations campaign, if you will. Public pressure on them is intense, including from the United States, their #1 ally globally. And the reality is that the Israeli government, they have internal pressures as well. The families of the hostages want to have their family members home. The Israeli people, of course, are being called up. The longer this goes on, it's been 8 months, the more resistance there will be probably economically from business leaders, et cetera, especially if Israel doesn't seem to be making progress on achieving their stated objectives, which are getting the hostages home and destroying Hamas. The pressure on Hamas is obvious. It's physical. You know, the Israelis in going into Rafah and closing that Rafah crossing, they have essentially made it harder for Hamas to smuggle materials. According to the Israelis, that was an area where they were smuggling materials into Hamas fighters. So there's increased physical pressure on them. There probably have been attacks successfully. We're reading a little bit about that in the media. But I think, Kailey, the overall problem for most of us watching this is that we're not really sure how much progress Israel's making. We don't know what the strategy is, so we can't measure even any progress that they tell us about against a strategy. And so it just looks like there's a lot of human suffering, and it's been going on for too long. And so the pressure on both sides has mounted, and hopefully this means this ceasefire agreement will actually hold.
Well, Evelyn, it seems that Joe Biden has had an evolution once again when it comes to Ukraine. And I'd love your thoughts on news from the White House now that the U.S. will allow Ukraine to launch U.S.-provided munitions against military targets in Russia. This idea of taking the fight to Russia was seen as escalatory. It's limited in scope, though. This will only be around Kharkiv, where obviously we've seen intense fighting and some trouble for Ukraine. Is it the right move now? Should it cover the entire country? What are you making of this?
Joe, I'm going to sound like John McCain. It's the right move, you know, a year ago, years ago. And so I'm saying it's overdue. And the other thing is that we keep drawing these red lines. I mean, Russia has drawn some red lines, and they threaten nuclear means all the time, you know, some kind of nuclear retaliation. But the reality is that the red lines that we hear about, you know, we don't want to give this weapon system or that weapon system, don't use the weapon system inside Russian territory, don't use the weapon system in occupied Crimea. All these lines have been drawn, frankly, by us because we're so afraid of escalation. So I'm happy to see that the Biden administration made this decision, but frankly, it's long overdue. People have been losing their lives, and Ukraine is in danger of losing that city if they aren't able to take action very soon.
But Evelyn, that fear of escalation you speak of, is that not warranted? Does the risk of escalation move higher as a result of this decision?
I don't think, Kailey, it does move higher as a result of this decision. You're right that there is always some danger of escalation, and the reward of taking on the risk has to be balanced against the potential escalation. But in this case, I think we all understood, those of us who have watched Vladimir Putin, that he wasn't going to use a nuclear weapon because the weapons we were already providing to Ukraine would now be allowed to target military assets inside of Russia proper. The Ukrainians have already been hitting refineries and other targets using their own munitions, and that didn't cause the Russians to lose their minds and use nuclear weapons. So I think the nuclear threshold is still pretty high in Moscow. And of course, you can never rule anything out, but I don't think that Vladimir Putin is suicidal.